Oh, all right, Zig on the top. Today on the show, we have Bennet Cerven of the Trouble Notes. Bennet is a violinist and composer, and the Trouble Notes are a trio whose music falls between traditional folk and progressive rock, with a self-described gypsy fusion flavor. Anywho, the Trouble Notes are playing July 3rd at Negative Space here in Cleveland, Ohio. That is coming up Thursday, July 3rd. Tickets are available and linked below. This trio, composed of violin, guitar, and percussion, sometimes drum kit, is a high-energy experience you do not want to miss. So all my Cleveland friends, or anyone around Cleveland, July 3rd, Negative Space. Tickets linked below. Anywho, to get into this conversation, this was a really inspired one. Bennet has had a really interesting journey going from a steady career he had set up in Wall Street, and jumping off that boat and diving into the sea of wanderlust and beauty and art and chasing that fully and finding success with it and being able to maintain it through the whole ups and downs of the pandemic and actively still at it. And then we kind of get into how does one handle this endless moving life and what's that look like and feel like when you have to take a break and stop and add some rest. And we also talk about the Trouble Notes' new direction they're going with their next project. So really cool stuff. At this point, I would usually share a song with the artist, but I'm going to require you, good listeners, to do your own research. The band is the Trouble Notes. They're available on all the streaming platforms. The tune I've been rocking out to the most lately has been Turkish Delight. The Banjalorian is the next follow-up for that. Definitely check out these guys. Like I said, all the streaming platforms. And lastly, before we get to the interview, if you hear anything you like, if you can like, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast on any of the podcast platforms, it helps me keep talking to cool guests like Bennet and sharing their insights with you. And without further ado, this is my conversation with Bennet from the Trouble Notes. Also, July 3rd, Negative Space, Cleveland, Ohio. Come see them live. I'm excited for the 3rd. Where are you guys at now?
I'm in San Antonio, Texas.
Texas?
So
Okay.
I am, just trying not to die.
Yeah,
So,
it's got to be hot
yeah.
out there, man. Holy shit.
Yeah, it's pretty warm. Although to be fair, like the Great Lakes areas are all pretty nasty in the summer. So I grew up over there, so I know what's up.
Okay. Where'd you grow up? Let's get into it.
Chicago.
We'll get into interview now. Okay. You grew up in
All
Chicago?
right, cool. So I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, and like right on the border, like literally on the border in Northwest Indiana. So yeah, but I was just gonna say, so it's like one of these areas where like everyone in Indiana says you're from Chicago, and everyone from Chicago says you're in Indiana. So like no one claims you, and so we're just kind of like in like no man's land. It's like Gary, East Chicago, Munster, like that whole area right there is just like it's lost.
Well, it's interesting because like I mean, kind of coming from that like vagueness of like landmass, it kind of leaves you to figure out where you fit in between all that. And like
That's a very good point.
And you guys have this wanderlust to your sound and to your story. So I wondered if that was ever like maybe a seed because of these early like kind of surroundings or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think you make growing up in that area. The problem was that you had the allure of Chicago, which was only about 30, 40 minutes away with a car. So it was a thing that you could go and get that city culture that you needed. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like it's very like suburban. And so there was just not a lot going on. And I noticed that, it's a lovely place to grow up. My high school was fantastic. My upbringing was great. So it's, I wouldn't complain there, and I had a cool circle of friends. But I think that it does leave for the average teenager much to be desired, and you could go down a lot of paths, so some people went into some kind of like dangerous, they gravitating toward partying too much and that kind of thing. And I think from my side, it was like, I was looking at the world and thinking, this area is great and all, and I'm thankful for my upbringing, but now I'm looking to see what else is out there. And that's, I think, what made me go to New York City. And then I started the group in New York City, and then,
So also, it's interesting in that, because I kind of grew up in that type of environment as well. And one thing I always noticed with like, and I was kind of grateful for like the early years in like the kind of suburban sense, because it let me lock myself into a bunker and practice and study. Where if I was like kind of in a more city aspect for myself, I'd be like, oh, what's going on? You know what I mean? So
I think that's a really good point. I think there's a lot of people I know that grow up downtown in major urban centers. They get incredibly desensitized because they're overstimulated all the time, and it's like either they lock themselves off completely, in which case like they they never escape and they kind of hide, or they get so overstimulated that they're like hard to relate to in a way
yeah,
because they've just everything is not cool because like I grew up in New York, and then it's just like, all right, well, there's you miss the small details and the beauty because you're just inundated with stimuli. And I think that's definitely you bring up a very valid point.
so with
Yeah.
your thank you. With your like musical upbringing, did you start with violin? What was your yeah, okay. So
Yeah, yeah.
family based or school introduced? How'd you get a violin in your hands?
I'm one of those kids that started really young. So I was like, I think I was 4 by the time I was like really playing properly. But like I started already taking music lessons at 3, and that came from mom. Yeah. Like mom really wanted me to be, she used to always make this joke, I want you to be a gentleman and a scholar. And, and for her, she grew up with music in the house. So she's not a musician by profession, but she is like in terms of she plays flute very well and piano and so when I was a kid and my sister, she started us very young and was like, you get to pick your instrument, don't care what it is, but you need to pick an instrument, and that was a really good move. Yeah. So
Yeah, that's huge. And also to kind of put it in your guys' hands, to make it open for you guys to choose which one. What, like, as a kid, do you think spoke to you about violin?
I must have, I don't know, I've asked myself this question a lot. I think I was taken to a a classical music concert, and I must have seen I vaguely remember it being Midori. I don't know if you know who that is, but Midori's like she was in like the early 90s. She was very, very popular in the United States as like a soloist in an orchestra. And I think that my mother must have taken us into the Chicago and to see Midori play. And then for some reason, I gravitated toward that sound. I mean, it's possible it's the only instrument I knew the name of at 3 years old.
Yeah,
But
that's possible too.
but for some reason, I said violin, and then I realized what I was getting myself into. But in truth, I've been on the other side of that as well. And like over the years of playing a lot and doing a lot of these kind of like family festivals or concerts or even playing in the streets, like early on, I've had these really moving experiences where people have said like, my child saw you play and now they're taking violin lessons. And I've actually gotten that feedback dozens of times, I think. And so I kind of have this feeling that, and some of those kids, like I even kind of gave some lessons to and whatnot, and whatever. So it's like, I think that that's kind of the experience that I had as well was, at an age I saw someone play violin. I don't vividly remember because I was too young, but that's what really, really made me do it.
But that's a whole nother thing when you get that feedback and see it come back and know that you kind of left a mark and you're picking up. And it's interesting too, like, because 3's such a young age to be like introduced to any like real thing beyond like Old MacDonald or like some type of
Yeah,
percussion.
well, it was Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, I think was what we started with. But like at that age, you're not really learning. I mean, you see
Yeah.
like videos of like these crazy prodigy kids that are whatever, and I mean, I don't want to profess that I was that, but I definitely by 4 or 5 or by 5, I'd say I could play pretty well, which is weird now in hindsight when you see pictures of yourself and you're like, oh my God, like look at that. Like when I was, you look like a little baby and it's like at that size, the violin's like this big and, but I started on a cookie box, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this was like a really cool thing. So I have to give a shout out to, there was a music school that I studied at, Northwest Indiana Suzuki School. And they had this thing where they would they would take a Girl Scout cookie box and you'd like cover it in, they'd make you do it, I think. So we'd like cover it with brown paper bag and then draw the violin on it. And then they glued like a ruler on it. And you'd have to like that as the instrument to learn the positioning, right?
Yeah.
And then you
sense.
use like, you remember those like those hangers that you put like trousers on or like pants on, you know, where they have that like cardboard tube. So they put like everything that you needed on the cardboard tube to make a bow, and then you played like that. And if you like learned the positioning correctly and stuck with it for more than, I don't remember how long, we say it was 2 months, then you got to eat the cookies at the end. That was the deal.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was such a smart, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, especially for kids at that point. Oh my God.
Yeah,
that's
you're 3 years old. Like, you get this whole box of cookies if you do it. You know, you're like, yay! So that was basically how I learned all the positioning. It's brilliant, actually. In hindsight, now I'm like, wow, what a smart idea. And I've never seen anybody do that since. I don't know if that was that school's like unique thing or who came up with that, but
they should do that though. That's a great.
Everybody should do that.
Because you know, at
guitars.
that, yeah, fine. Well, man, I wonder. There's probably a bigger box than for a guitar.
Well, it's like, you know, I mean, when you're 3 years old, everything is huge, right?
True,
so like
true,
a little box of cookies. It's like, what in the world? Yeah.
Okay, one thing like I find like what with that's really interesting. Aside at that age too, not only like positioning is challenging, but when you're introduced to the kind of musical concept, your brain's like adapting and learning that language, and it's becoming. I gotta imagine it became like a second language quicker for you because you started that early, being introduced and like partaking in it. So like, sorry.
Yeah. Well, if that's the question, then yes. Like, I think that's exactly what's happened. What happened was like, because I have my musical theory knowledge is good, but like I have some friends that are crazy. You know, like you can mention, you know, 3 notes and they're like, oh, well, it could fit in that quarter, this quarter, this quarter, this quarter, blah 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 blah. And it's like with me, I have this very innate ability to. Someone could play 2 notes and it's like already I can kind of already be like, all right, I'm going to play this to follow. And I don't know. It's very complicated to explain, but like my brain just understands like, okay, you're probably in this scale and it just happens. And I think that is from learning theory at 3 years old and then just having it my entire life that I have a command of my instrument as if it's a language.
That's like I think that's the ultimate goal with any type of theory or any type of like any musical concept that you're learning is for it to eventually become that. Like that's the mastery of that. And like that's because like, man, because I started really leaning into like understanding music theory in like high school, but only for the aspect or only for the benefit of being able to go, because when I was young, when I was in like middle school, my dad would take me to bars and I'd play at Mike nights and stuff, you know what I mean?
Sick.
So like,
cool.
You know, you kind of get the real world application of playing music compared to the academics, like a whole other thing, but they coexist in a different way that I think they, you know, benefit the player equally in just different shades. So like,
I could not agree with that more. I mean, my experience has been that most like great classical musicians are not amazing performers because they are so technical that they don't put themselves in situations where they're uncomfortable. And so when you're in a situation where you're uncomfortable and you have to create a performance, it's a completely different skill set than like when you are, you know, doing exactly what you're doing and then getting to the theory kind of later. But like at that point, you're 10 legs up on, okay, I'm in a bar. There's a load of people in here who have no interest in hearing what I'm playing. And I need to fill this space, grab their attention, and also deliver a performance. And that is a very valuable skill as a performer that a lot of people just don't have.
Where did you start to develop that skill? Because growing up, it sounds like you were in the classical world, in the kind of like concert, like place where you're supposed to see violin. When did you start to like explore and take it out and like really, I guess, you know, take it to the streets in a sense?
Well, that was in New York. So okay. I played I had a very classical upbringing. I mean, you know, there were a lot of people who would always say that I was a very animated performer. So even when I was playing classical, I moved around a lot. I really embodied the music, but like that's a slippery slope because like technically classical like soloists, which I was, they were kind of like, oh, you know, some people would say that that's distracting. You know, it's like, oh, you know, you're not supposed to do that much movement. You're not supposed to this and that. So there was like all these, you know, slap on the wrist. Don't develop that technique. Don't make it squeal like that. Don't do this. Don't, you know, there's a lot of don'ts as much as do's. So it can be a restrictive and suffocating world as well if you're not careful. I mean, that's all, you know, teachers and audience and whatnot. But I when I got into the university, I kind of put the instrument down for a little while, and then when I was about 20 years old, I was in New York and I met these guys, and they were, you know, musicians that had just moved into the same building as me in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Although that, not to sound glamorous, it was like on the river, so it's a different thing than like if you're like next to Central Park. That's like, you know, this is like working class stuff. So I was like all the way out by the river, and basically I met these two dudes, and they were, you know, sitting on my porch outside my building, and I'd kind of just moved in, and they seemed like my age, and they seemed cool, and so I just introduced myself, and they were like, "Yeah, we're musicians." And I was like, "Oh, that's so cool. And, you know, tell me what's going on." And they were like, "Oh, we just started this band, you know, and we were two guitarists. And, oh, man, we'd really love to find a like a violinist." And I was like, "Well, I got a violin upstairs. I can play." And so, like, I went upstairs and we had a jam. And then, you know, they were like, "Man, you're pretty good. Like, you want to play with us?" And I was like, "Sure. What do you want to play?" And they were like, "Well, we play in the streets." And I was like, "All right, tell me when." And so like I was working, you know, and going to school and working and doing all that stuff during the days. And then at night I was all around the city busking. And then that's eventually when I made my own group.
Okay. Who were the two guitarists, and what was the name of the group you guys were?
So the group exists still to this day. It's a totally different formation. They're called City of the Sun. Okay. And that's a player like John Pita. He and I are still pretty good friends. He's playing, and they're like, their formation's totally different. They have a drummer. I think they're two guitarists now and a bass, and they make really cool music. You know, did a lot of stuff. I think they even played at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago. And like, so they're doing really well. And we were, you know, we played some pretty cool stuff in New York City. And then one of the other guys' names was Adam. I kind of lost track with him. I know he moved out to Los Angeles, but he was, you know, writing. He was a songwriter. He was pretty good, but he was a little. Sometimes we creatively didn't agree on stuff. So that was part of the reason why I think all three people kind of split their ways. And he moved to LA, and then I, you know, eventually wandered off as well. So
okay. So when you guys kind of split, and you're like, you're going to school for music as well?
No, I wasn't. I was studying like economics and diplomacy and all. I was basically trained to be a diplomat.
Gotcha. The scholarly part that your mom pitched at the beginning.
Yeah, that's not wrong. Yeah, that's not wrong. So, yeah. And then after that, so I went to New York, and I was in New York City. I stayed out there for about 6 or 7 years. And then I was, at the time I was working on Wall Street, and I was like, I had this like really intense day job. And then I started playing in the streets at night, and I met this dude from France, and he at a party, like in a squat in Brooklyn, and the two of us hit it off. And at the time he was like making beats and like rapping, and then I was like playing along with, you know, so it was pretty avant-garde. And then one day we were just hanging out at a friend's place, and he picked up a guitar and started doing some kind of like rumba rhythms. And I was a big fan of Rodrigo y Gabriela. I don't know if you know who they are.
Yeah, no, they rip. They're amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so we ended up actually touring with them.
Yeah,
in
2019, I saw that. I was going to bring that up,
which was awesome. But so like they were like already an inspiration for me, like in 2012, 2011, and I remember like seeing the technique that he had and was like, dude, you could play this stuff. Like, and I showed it to him and he was like, oh, maybe, like very nonchalant français, huh? And it was like, maybe, and he started to play. And so then I was like, all that DJ stuff, forget that stuff, man. Like, let's go out into the streets. You play that guitar and I'll play some violin and let's just rip some stuff. And so we started busking and then we made a band, and the band we made was the Trouble Notes. And then that was kind of how it started. So we were just improvising in the streets, basically. And then it eventually morphed into, this idea of traveling. And, because he was from France, his visa was kind of an issue. And so I decided either I lose him, he goes back to Europe, and I go back to, my job, which I was still keeping, but that I had no one to play with. Or I should just quit my job and go. And so that's what I did. And then basically, ever since then, people have kind of jumped on and off as we've moved. But that's been the origin of the group.
That's incredible. It's interesting to kind of be living these like dual realities at that time for you. That's really fascinating to be kind of having this high-end job and I'm sure this this safety. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
knowing that this is
safe.
Solid, you're going to be all right. And then, but the life and the excitement and the beauty of being in these warehouses with this DJ set, you know what I mean?
It was weird. I mean, that part was really funny. Because I had this necktie. So the first album that we ever made was called Lose Your Ties. And it was all for me about this necktie. So it was the thing that ties you back. But it was that necktie became a symbol for me of what was tying me down from traveling and from experiencing an adventure. And I still remember I have this very vivid memory of where I was working. There was, long story short, we were making this new company, and they wanted me to get a promotion and do all this stuff and basically move up within this new company. And that was kind of what pushed me into the corner of this is my moment. I need to decide, am I going to take this thing, which is a career path, but it's going to consume my life? Or am I going to, I'm 23 or 4 years old. I was like, do I take the risk and, just travel a bit and get wild? And I can always come back to this. That was my thinking. And so I remember sitting on it for about 2 days, and then I came back and I went into my superior's office, and he was like, okay, so, are you ready to start on the new thing? And, let's talk money. And I was like, listen, I'm going to leave. And his first reaction was anger. And he was like, all right, who poached you? Which firm are you going to? He was really mad, and you have a non-compete, that kind of thing. And I was like, well, no, I'm actually going to go to Europe and I'm going to play music. And his face just softened, and he was like, that is really cool. He was like, go for it, kid. And stood up, shook my hand, and was like, we're here for you if you ever need it. And then that was it. And that was 11 years ago, or 12 even now. Christ,
man.
Oh my God, time flies. 13.
Wow.
Shit.
But that's such what I mean? I think a lot of people in that situation understand how just intense and kind of life-sucking certain gigs can be. So that's really cool that he recognized that, and not only said good luck, but also welcomed you back if you needed. You know what I mean? That's you know what I mean? A lot of times that's the part of the story you don't really hear is when you jump into the humanity, the also the humanity that's being left there, and most people recognize how big a step that is, and that's so. Because I've been diving into your guys' story a bit to get ready to talk with you, and I think that's a really important factor is that little bit right there coming from that's so cool. Musically, did you do any traveling aside to New York? Were you was the Wanderlust just building up, or did you have experience doing it? And I guess the other end of that question would be, or did the music kind of fuel oh, this type of sound makes me want to go experience it?
Well, I had done some traveling, but obviously not anything like what we're talking about now.
Right.
But about 2 months before I quit the job, I went to Paris for a holiday. So my family went out there with me, and I went out. and while I was out there, you know, I brought a violin with me and just played alone in the streets of Paris. And that was kind of like for me like I'm going to test the waters and just see how this feels. And I mean, it wasn't like particularly glamorous by any means, but I remember like playing and then like some people coming and giving me money and me being like, and like smiling and looking at me and whatever. And I made probably like, I don't know, 20 euros in like 30 minutes or so, like playing like near the Notre Dame. And then that made me think like, okay, I could do this. Like, even I can do it on my own. Like, imagine what I can do with a team. And so that was why, like, I went back and I saw my dad that night, like, after I'd gone off on my own a little bit and, like, sat down and was like, I'm buying you a drink. And I was like, and this is the drink that, I was like, this drink that I'm buying you, I just pulled out of the street over there, from playing for 20, 30 minutes while I was walking around. And then I kind of told him what I was thinking about. And he gave me the similar story that, that if I was going to do it, I should do it now and not look back 10 years later and think, what if? So, which was cool. Having that from them, both my mom and dad, like, was also pretty helpful because I was pretty concerned that they were going to be like, don't you dare, you're an idiot, don't give up your career, blah, 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 which, I mean, not to say they didn't think that,
Yeah.
but they were supportive.
But I mean, I think at the core of everybody, we know that wanderlust is there and this beauty in the world, and we all kind of want to go experience and jump in it. And like, if only we had like a skill or an asset in ourselves to excuse ourselves to run from like the mundane to do it, And like, music is like an incredible excuse to do that because you can blend a lot of different sounds in a lot of different areas,
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I also think that there's we always used to say that you can experience the world in a really unique way if you're traveling as a musician, because like locals basically want to show you the local experience. So when you go somewhere you've never been, like oftentimes it's like, oh, you're a tourist and you're going to do touristy things. But like when you come as a musician, a lot of times people are like, oh, you got to see my world. Like, I want to show you my Paris, or I want to show you my London, or, my Rome, whatever it might be. And so like that is such a cool thing that we've had in the last like 12 years or so. We've had a chance to see a lot of really interesting, places and, have different experiences that we may not otherwise have been able to have.
I believe that like, honestly, you guys are coming to one of my favorite places in Cleveland. Like,
that's great.
Negative Space is the place I show people.
That's awesome. This is really cool. So this is like, I mean, Cleveland is a city that, even though I'm from the Midwest, I never went to as a kid. So I've been in a few other places in Ohio. I used to make that journey out east all the time because I lived in New York. So, and a lot of times, like, especially when I was in college, I was driving. But like when you take 80, you go underneath Cleveland. And so if you were stopping in Ohio, you're in Youngstown or Akron, or like you can get to Akron or like wherever. I was in Cincinnati when I was younger, but I never went to Cleveland. And so last year was the first time. And I remember being like, we got right into that there's like this kind of port.
Mm-hmm. The flats is where you guys were.
Is it Erie? What is it? Lake Erie,
yep.
Right? Or is it
yep.
Erie? Yeah. So right on Erie there. And I remember seeing that, like where the music box is, and being like, man, this city's pretty cool. Like it's pretty. And also it had like, it's very multicultural as well, which I think is really dope. Because like some cities, like when they're like too monocultural, like they get a little sterile. And I think like Cleveland had something going on, it had like some streety pizzazz to it as well. And so like it was cool. I could imagine like there being a lot of really cool corners that we just didn't get to see yet.
Oh, for sure. And that's with anywhere, but I'm super excited to show you guys the gallery for sure.
Awesome.
I wanted to ask about the Spice of Life.
The Spice of Life.
Mm-hmm. In London.
You know this place or what?
I know you guys went there.
Yeah. Well, that's weird. I don't know how you know that.
I did some research.
That was that's amazing. Good for you, man. That's really early days. The Spice of Life was the first open mic that we played in London. So I think it may have even been the first gig that we played in London back in 2013. And what happened was like we left. The French guy and I left New York, Sylvain, and like he and I went to London and we started busking. And basically we were like, we're going to immerse ourselves every night. We're going to play. We're going to play in the streets all day. We're just going to play nothing but music and refuse to not make it. And the Spice of Life was the first open mic that we did in Soho. And we went back and we played even our own show. We had like our own like headline show there about a month later, and it was a really cool place. I don't know if it still exists, but yeah, that's wild. That was memory lane right there. Good for you.
That's awesome.
That must be a really. How did you find that? Is that like a really old video or something?
Well, you're the Trouble Notes. We gotta know. Let me narwhal my situation there. But yeah, no, I did a lot of.
You must have deep dove, man, because good for you. This Spice of Life is I think that is the first venue that we played in London. I'm fairly certain. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, those things are important, and I think as anyone who's starting to play music or starting to dive in any creative endeavor, the origin story is super important. Like that's the point of departure, that I understand what you did, and then there's a point in which the hero's journey started, and I know you went on it. I don't know that for myself yet, right? As an individual listening to the story. And like mic nights, so here in Cleveland, I host a fair amount of mic nights, and like they're a magic starting base that welcomes so many people, and I'm lucky that most of the ones I get to host, the crowds are very supportive, you know what I mean, and very into people growing and trying new things, and like that's where I started. So like anytime I can try to see someone's origin story, you know, start from there, I think it's a crucial importance to any scene wherever, but especially with your guys' story where you're jumping into this head first, full-time, going at it. So like you would hit mic nights and you would busk, and like busking is a very like special set of skills. It's a unique way of performing, and it's a unique way of thinking of how to perform. So
totally.
I guess, yeah, it's like, because I've done it a handful of times. Another like it's kind of like, and also I think most of us did it in 2020 digitally. It was just much harder because you had
totally that too.
But so I guess from doing this busking and like diving into it, what were some like kind of lessons you've gleaned from busking that you see in your own compositions now?
Oh yeah, well, I mean the old strategy was like what we would do at the very beginning was we'd go out and take music that we were working on into the streets, and we would basically start playing and those tracks. And if people didn't stop, then we knew that we needed to change something about that track. And that was one of the many reasons early on that we used to say that like the cities that we were playing in, so London and New York in particular, that they had such a formative kind of mark on our music, because literally when we were playing in the streets, there were loads of tracks early on that we thought were really good. And it was like people would just walk by, and then we were like, oh, maybe this melody isn't that strong. Like maybe we need to do something to it. And I mean, in a way, the way we developed our style was by playing really animated and fast and jumping around a lot. And like all that energy that we would put out was basically like a desire to be like, hey, I'm here, see me. And I think that definitely played to our advantage and made us better performers. And then what we would do is once we felt like we'd honed, like this one is working, that one's working, that one's working, then we would take that to an open mic, and those would be like our 3 tracks at the open mic. And if the feedback at the open mic was also like, yo, this is good, then we were like, okay, then these 3 are going to become like real tracks. We just need to now figure out what they mean. And that was kind of like the early way of developing our sound was, you know, like basically we joke that we cook, you know, you cook it in the street, and then you basically put it on somebody's plate in the open mic and see if it tastes good.
I love that approach though. Oh my God, because it's like it's as on point and from the most instant reaction you can get as can be. Like,
Yeah.
so I guess a couple more questions within the process of that. Would you guys would you present a melody or like a chord progression, or like, how did kind of like some of the early compositions start?
Um, yeah, it was one or the other. So like sometimes like the earliest compositions, I mean, we're talking like back like 2012, 2011, they were like either melodies that I had in, in my, I'd heard or felt in my brain, where I was like, okay, this is a melody. I like this, and then basically I'd play the melody my brain, like I don't, now I think as like my compositional style is significantly more kind of progressive and crazy. But like back in those days, I was kind of writing basically like pop songs, but like instrumentally. So it's like, okay, this is the verse, this is the chorus, this is the verse, this is the chorus. And I still think that way, but like now with like a lot more, oh, we're going to change the rhythm here, we're going to do this or whatever, so it's a little bit more, yeah, like so progressive in style. But the earlier days, I'd probably be like, okay, this is how I hear the verse, this is how I hear the chorus, and then I'd start jamming. And the Sylvan was a very good jammer, like where he could just kind of find, okay, well, I'll play these four chords or these, whatever, and then I'll just do this, and so then we both gave each other the freedom to just kind of fumble around a little bit during our early jams. And then we started finding things that felt good. And when you get into a groove with somebody that you're jamming with, you know when you're locked. When it's like, oh, yo, okay, we're together, and I'm anticipating where you're going, and you're anticipating where I'm going, and so yeah, that early kind of process began that way. So it was a mix, to answer your question, of maybe somebody being like, hey, I like these chords, what would you write to this, or the other way.
That makes sense. No, and it is like one of those things. There's a unique connection when people sing together or play together. I know definitely when we sing together, like I think it's God, what's the neurochemical that's released in our brain? I want to say oxytocin, but I could be wrong. But there's a certain thing that happens in our mind that I'm blanking right now, and as an NMT, I'm messing this up. But that definitely makes that spark when it's clicking, and like there's nothing like it. But like I guess another aspect too, when you're like getting feedback from playing in the street, did you find like what element of music did you find you guys' compositions had to morph more often than not? Because I would imagine, from my experience, but I would imagine it might be similar, would be like a kind of rhythmic aspect would catch people more in travel.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I think, yeah, I think that rhythmic, I mean, to be honest, like the thing that we definitely did, which I think even in some ways develops kind of bad habits in a way, is like you just have a tendency to play everything really fast. And the reason that you do that, and because like it's catchy, and also because you've only got, like, catchy not as in catchy for the ear, but catchy for the eyes. Like to see somebody, like freaking out like that, it grabs you. But I think also the second reason for that is, if you've only got someone's attention for 15 to 20 seconds, you want to develop the track as much as possible. So and I've never gotten into the Spotify only write 2 minute and 50-second songs and like start with the chorus, and you know what I mean, like that whole, like the way that songwriting has kind of developed for algorithms is the same in a way.
Yeah.
Where it's like, in the first 30 seconds give somebody everything so that they can decide whether or not they like it, because otherwise you're getting skipped. And I think like street music in some ways kind of creates a similar problem where, I can't develop a melody over a minute, which I could do in a theater, because, you're either catching in the middle of, so it's out of context, or you're just not sticking around long enough to be able to really feel the whole thing develop. And so that made us like play really fast and animated, because that was our way.
Right. No, that makes sense. That would, because just like you're saying, you have from that guy's bus stop to the corner there to get his attention, and like the comparison from the busking to the digital busking of like any like algorithm now, I gotta imagine, like, aside from just like the 30 seconds, here it is, you know what I mean? Like, becomes like a skill set to hone, but also a skill set where, like how you said, that can be limiting in a bit. So how have you guys kind of found to balance the two? Or are you still working on it? Because, like, I'm still working
Well,
on it.
yeah, I don't. Well, I think that so our kind of way now is well, first, like when it comes to Spotify stuff, like we just make what we make, and I've tried very hard not to sacrifice too much to do what's better for Spotify, but that's also because, like, to be fair, we're not really in, like, the music that we make doesn't it doesn't appeal to, it's not pop music, or it's not like hip hop music where, there's a huge broad market for it, where you're competing with a lot of people, but at the same time, like, there's also a lot of playlists and this and that you could find yourself in, and so it really makes sense to gear your music for this format, so to speak. Whereas, like, for us, I think we're really good. Like, what we do very well is tell stories, and we tell stories with the music. And so, like, if you were at, for example, at Negative Spaces, so at the live show in Cleveland, the way that our music, like our show is that, like, there will be kind of a narration and then the music, and then a narration and then the music, and a narration and the music. And so there's this dynamic that's happening where you're being told to close your eyes or to dance and to feel something and to see pictures in your mind. And then basically we try to create a soundtrack for that. So I think our new formula, the one that we're kind of developing toward right now, that I think will be really the crux of our next album, is like, we're going to see our next album like a soundtrack, and just be like, we've written a story, and, track 1 until track 17 or whatever it is, like, each one of them is a scene of a particular story. And, I think we'll have some sort of narration and some extra texts and poetry and things that get weaved into the music to help guide the story and guide the listener. And it'll maybe be with, like a small novella that you could read and this and that. But, it's really geared toward an experience and an immersive experience, rather than, I think a lot of tracks now, like, people focus on singles, and they, like, the Spotify algorithm rewards people for writing one-off tracks that are, a certain length, that have, that are very front heavy. And, because if you get skipped, it's very bad for you. So you need to, and it's like, for me, I think I want to go back to the long format of the album. And if that doesn't work well on Spotify, then oh well.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the artistry of it. You know what I mean? Like, most of the digital anything that matters is for the venues. They're like, maybe we shouldn't book them, look at their number, or maybe we should book them, look at their numbers. And, like, but it's always like a separate, from my experience, it's been a separate duality. Someone could be popping on Spotify, but only 3 people came to the club. And, like, that's a friend I have, and it's frustrating for them, and I would be too. But, like, I find that sounds like a freaking sweet record, man. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's something we're very, in a lot of ways, we're really excited about it. And, we've got it now. We're basically focused the last months of the year and the first part of next year at really just getting it done and finding, full disclosure, I think what's been challenging for us in some ways is making the transition from being this really awesome street band to becoming a really great festival band, which is now where we are. Like, we're one of these groups that does, if you catch a performance of us on a stage at a festival, we're throwing a full, prog folk rave, like, that's happening, like, and it's great. But now we want to show, and even because we're deeper than that, and we have a lot to say, and so, like, there's this whole new layer that we're trying to add, and I think that's the format and the sound that we haven't found yet, is like, okay, how do we progress from, first we were street travelers, and then we were, this great, fun, energetic, festival group, and we still want to stay that, but now we want to bring it to, like, okay, but also you should come to a show because you're going to get taken on a journey, and, like, this is how. And so I think that's that third part is where we are of like trying to, kind of like decide, okay, this is who we want to be for the foreseeable future. And I know we have the vision, but now it's about really executing it.
It definitely is like a challenging spot because just like the festival is kind of like a bigger street with a lot of people in one spot. Like, you
Correct.
know what I mean? So
Correct.
it's hard to, cause I find with my group, we have a similar aspect where like musically or visually, some of this like people can see because I play a bunch of weird instruments and like visually like, oh, this is really interesting, and you know what I mean. And like, now how do you translate that same interest just audibly, right? And how do you take
Right.
like because we've been working on a crazy concept record as well, not to the same level you guys are, but it's also just a different thing. So and I think that's part of just the artistry of it, right? And I think you guys pulling what you do and performing how you do, I think maybe not all of the audience would follow. I can talk
Yeah.
today, but a large chunk will because of the musicalities already like pulled them in.
Right.
So like
Yeah.
I'm
Well, and
excited.
I think that's the question is like, I had this explained to me once. I thought it was an amazing image, and it's very true. It's like, if you see your music and if you see your fan base as well as a pond or a lake, a still body of water can become very stale and toxic if it doesn't have outflow and inflow to constantly be refreshing it and changing stuff as well. And so I think there's like the musicians and the artists that have had really great, long, enviable careers in a lot of ways are the ones who have gone through APOS and they've found a way to keep kind of like maturing and transforming themselves while basically bringing their core audience along and then having other people hop on and off throughout the ways and being like, this era I loved, this era not so much. But you look at certain bands, like some of my favorite bands as well, it's like, well, I mean, a perfect example is the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So like 80s Red Hot Chili Peppers, like they're just a funk band. You know what I mean? They're like a crazy, groovy, weird funk band. And then all of a sudden the 90s come. So you're talking their career was like they were almost together 10 years before like 93. And then all of a sudden they start releasing Californication and then Stadium Arcadium. And that's 20 years into their career before, they work with Ruben. And like, they've been going at it for 20 years before that happens. And like that record, some of like the early Chili fans hate that record. It's commercial, it's crap, it's all these things. But it's like that also was probably the most iconic or second most iconic record that they ever made. And so, I don't think you can keep everybody happy all the time as long as you stay true to yourself and you believe in what you want. I think it'll work. Like if all of a sudden we were like, oh yeah, like Sony's going to sign us to play, AC/DC covers. I can understand why the majority of our fan base would be like, this is great, but like we're not interested in this really. And it's like fair play, like, and then we're just going to get a totally new fan base and, we'd be sacrificing everything that we built. But I think the direction that we're going is still very true to who we are. And while the sound might change a little bit and, some of the aesthetics might change, like who we are as artists at the core of it and the authenticity of it won't. That's what I'm hoping for. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I
but
think
that's what I'm hoping
yeah,
for.
no, I think as long as anyone if you're inspired by somebody, you're gonna dig their work. You know what I mean? Like, and just like you, and the fact that like you guys are still actively trying to achieve more musically and spiritually through this, or just fulfillment. That's what I'm looking for. It's going to come off. Like, and I think those moments, like as someone who is fans of things, like for an artist I enjoy, like I think of the band Go Go Bardello, which you probably came in cross paths with them in
Oh
New
yeah,
York.
they were also kind of an early inspiration. To be fair, like in New
Yeah.
York, I
Okay.
remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
big time.
Yeah, man. Very cool. But just like their later records as of recent have been more songwritery. You know what I mean? And maybe, but I like that. I find
Yeah,
that and I'm like, man, Eugene's a great songwriter. Look
Yeah,
at
he
these
is.
like philosophical little insights. You know what I mean? Like, so I think like that's inspiring to hear that at the level you guys are at, with as much success and like wanderlust as you're like putting out, there's still more. And I think that's
Oh
the
yeah,
hugest takeaway.
yeah, cool. Thanks. Well, I think also just like it's about there are I think there are some people that perform because they love performing, and then like when you talk about like composition, I think there's always a desire from a lot of composers to challenge themselves. That they've got something to say, or like for us also, I think there's this whole like you know you run the risk. I think with a lot of bands, and I think Gogol Bordello is probably a great example of this. It's like you run the risk of having everything sound the same if you don't change. And so like that's the thing is like how many times can you write "Start Wearing Purple" or like you could basically write that same gypsy punk track and it's like by record 5, I think the audience, like the majority of people will be like, oh, And so I think that Eugene is basically saying, I've got a lot to say, but I need to change slightly the vehicle in which I deliver it so that it doesn't all basically fall into the same formula. There's something I think inspiring about that too, because he's pushing himself creatively to develop and explore. And so,
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's that's the takeaway from all these guys is to try to do that ourselves when we're a creative person, whatever person we are inspired by that's trying something different, like only kind of opens that door for you. It's also kind of that scary of, oh right, I'm comfortable, we're doing well. If I rock the boat too much, I might not get these gigs anymore. You know what I mean? It kind of is returning to that plateau of like comfort gig. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well, I definitely know people on the other side of that too. That like, musicians who are, in their 40s or 50s or even older, who are really, 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 they've built a fan base, they've got a style, and it's like, nah, man, this is my lane. I'm not going to sing about things that are over here. I'm going to talk about these things, and I'm going to do it in this style because this is what my audience wants, and I don't want to rock the boat. And like, that's also fine. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're all, I think that the misnomer is that there's a right way to do things. And like that, I think everybody's got to find their way. I think that I've had both amazing ideas that have gone super well, and then I've tried some things and been like, oh no, what did I do? Like when I look back at it, I'm like, oh no, that was a mistake. So I've done it all. Like I've messed up loads of stuff, and I'm still learning. So,
well,
but I'm
definitely.
not afraid I'm not afraid to make a mistake. I think that's the point.
I was gonna say, I think that's the takeaway for sure. And they kind of put a pin. Some artists, when they stick to the thing, you're kind of like, wow, they really just kept going with it, and you become a different type of inspired. Like one band that
Yes.
kind of strikes me like with that, and I also I guess has a correlation to you guys. Maybe other members might be able to answer this a little more. Is like a band like Motorhead, who's like
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
like consistent. But you don't want it any other way. But
Correct.
also, I guess you guys have some connection to Motorhead as well.
Well, yeah. So not anymore, but our original drummer,
Okay.
Ollie, he left a couple of years ago. He's back in London, but he all good. We're still absolutely mates, and it was just like one of these moments where our lifestyle's not always easy, and I think he needed to.
Yeah.
But his father was one of the original like tour managers and roadies for Motorhead, and Phil Taylor, the drummer, the longtime drummer of Motorhead, was his godfather, and Lemmy put his parents together, and yeah, so it was pretty crazy. Like there's a lot of connection to Motorhead there actually, and Blondie and loads of like, because there was this scene in the 1970s in West London where a lot of those guys all hung out in this area where my buddy grew up, and we used to play in that part of West London very frequently. So that was kind of like walking in those footsteps, and I think there's something to be said about that Motorhead thing, that like that really rock and roll was an influence in the energy of our music, and so we have. I mean, I love rock, like so, and especially like really aggressive rock like that. So I think that putting that into folk music and finding kind of the connection between those two of like just this really driving rhythm with bendy, aggressive melodies, and like that is something that's kind of at its core of some of our compositions, and that comes from a love of Motorhead and rock and roll.
That's
100%.
sick. That's sick.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess one question to kind of wrap it up, man. I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited for you guys to be at the gallery here on July 3rd.
Me too, man.
So being always kind of in motion, right? Like, and kind of the challenging. It's a challenging lifestyle. Do you find yourself like when you're not in motion, like having trouble resting, like? Or do you find yourself like, or is that like you're looking around like?
Well, because my so our manager and booking agent is also my partner, and like we've been together for 11 years, and so she's laughing because
Congrats, that's awesome.
Wow, yeah, she knows the answer that
yeah.
The answer to that question is yes, and
Okay.
to be honest with you, I don't know a single person though that has this, that travels as much as like that travels more than half of a year that doesn't have that problem. Right. So what ends up happening is you lay roots everywhere, and so then suddenly what happens is like when you stop, you're like, oh my God, like when am I going to go back and visit those people? And when am I going to go visit these people? But also I really always wanted to go here, and I've always wanted to go there. And there's this feeling of like, when you've been doing it for so long that what happens is like the world, if you, it's something I'm learning, is that like stopping for a little while, like the world will go on without you, but at the same time, like you don't need to be in that other place tomorrow. You can be there in a month, and it will still be okay. But there is that struggle of, like we've laid seeds everywhere, and we have these great friends, and it's like sometimes you only get to see them for a day a year, or a day every 2 years, and it's like when you do see them, a whole lifetime has gone by. It feels like that their families have developed, they've moved, they've built a business, or they've lost a business, or they've God forbid, also like we have moments like right now we have a situation where a fan of ours who's been very, very dear to us passed away early on at the beginning of the year, and it's like one of these things where that realization hits is like, oh my God, like this is what happens when you've been traveling and you have like this very diverse group of friends who are young and old. Some of our friends are 18 and some of them are 80, 86, and it's like family and friends, and everybody's aging and you're moving. And so that dynamic of the never ending tour, as Bob Dylan said, that dynamic is not always easy. And it's a sacrifice that you make, that you have to sacrifice weddings and funerals and all sorts of stuff to be constantly moving like we are. So I think that's, I've heard a lot of really great performers talk about this, and it's not an easy thing, but there are a lot of things that make it worth it as well. So most artists like that are constantly moving. We're all trying to find our balance. I think that's the key word. And things have a tendency to get very out of balance if you're not careful. You have to really understand how to stake out your line in the sand and be like, this is my border, and I really need to not. I need to have some like constraints that I impose on myself, because if I don't, then I'll never be home and I'll miss everything. So you have those two things. It's like I always want to be out there, but at the same time, then I think to myself, oh my God, if I don't take care of my own life, then I'm going to get in trouble. So
I think that's well said, and I guess that's one of those things. So for you, it's just kind of keep in check, on those like what you can do right here type such, or is that like what's kind of a quick example of just like how you kind of center yourself or balance yourself?
Well, I think that, you know, what I'm what I'm doing now, let's take the example that we gave earlier about writing a story album and all that stuff. Like, it's really difficult to write something and produce the sound quality, build the team, do all these things when you're constantly traveling. Because, you know, you're in a different time zone, or you've only got a few hours and you're not in your own space creating your own whatever. You're kind of at the luxury of, or at the you're exposed to kind of the elements of wherever you are. And so I think that the way that I've been trying to find balance is by understanding that you need to take time to focus on your art and also like your personal relationships that you're building in order to be able to be more successful as a touring artist. Because if you're constantly touring like we were, then what ultimately happens is like you kind of your quality suffers a little bit because you never really take the time to fix some bad habits, or, you know, to focus on and take stock of what's been working and what hasn't, because it's just like you can't really look back at what you've been doing because you're so focused on the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I think that makes it really difficult to be sort of, what's the word, self-reflective,
Right.
You know, to look in the mirror and be like, okay, I just was on the road for 4 months. Like, what worked and what didn't, and like, let's not do anymore the thing that didn't work. Whereas like sometimes I find that we'll do the same thing that didn't work for 4 straight years because we never gave ourselves the time to reflect on what wasn't working. You know what I'm saying? So I think now understanding that, and understanding like, don't just go, but carve out time to sit, meditate, breathe, you know, and take stock of what's been working and what hasn't, and be more self-reflective. I think that's something that like now this year we're doing a better job of when we get to the end of the year, and we're going to take that time, and we took it at the beginning of the year. So, yeah.
Well, I think those are wise words. I think you're putting rest notes in the treble notes.
Ah, good. No, but that's great. But that's an amazing analogy, because sometimes knowing when not to play is more important than knowing when to play.
Right.
And I think that's something that you need to learn, you know, and like also knowing when to say no to something. But I think, you know, because like at the beginning when you're first starting out, you're saying yes to everything. And to be completely honest, the pandemic did that.
Yeah.
That the pandemic, we were flying in 2018 and 19, and then the pandemic happened, and we panicked because our way of life was so disruptive, and we basically said yes to everything. And when you do that, then, you know, you kind of devalue yourself, and you lose a little bit of who you are and who you want to be, and you lose that balance. And that's kind of what happened. So we're getting it back.
Well, that's awesome, man. Thank you so much for taking so much time and sharing so much wisdom. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the 20th, or I almost said 23rd, the 3rd of July at Negative Space, man. It's gonna be awesome.
Yeah, man, me too. I think we're really looking forward to come back to Cleveland. So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for asking some really well-researched and thought-provoking questions, which, you know, that self-reflection thing we were talking about, I just had some of it now, so I appreciate you.
Well, that means a lot, man. Thank you.
Yo, Spike Spiegel here. You just listened to Zig at the Gig podcast. Keep riding the bebop. See you, Space Cowboy. Bang.